And that was really important in this journey, because as we embrace our shadows, I think an important part of it is understanding how we in 2023 are a part of this, I guess you could say, like, fabric of the universe. All of this is right somehow, and all the darkness that we've been brought is right somehow.
Weird and Worthwhile Podcast.
Welcome. Today we spoke with Jessica Depatie. She is an entrepreneur, filmmaker, podcaster, and she helps people do what's called shadow work, which is an investigation of the unseen elements of themselves, or the unrevealed aspects of themselves, which may be challenging to visit, but incredibly rewarding to do so. This was perhaps my favorite podcast conversation we've had so far. It was just so rich. There was an incredible amount of wisdom pouring through this woman and delivered so eloquently. It was just a lot of fun. And I know there's something in here for you. So I would really recommend staying to the end for this one, because it's a goodie. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome. We're going to start off with a meditation, one of my favorites. Really quick, powerful practice. One of perhaps the most powerful practice that I'm aware of to shift the mental state in just 3 minutes, to clear out the mental junk, to access a bit more clarity. I feel more like me after I do this. It's a good way to wake up. It's a good way to do a lot of things. It's a good way to get out of a funk. It's a good way to not make a bad decision. I've used this to avoid making bad decisions before. I was like, I'm about to make a bad decision, aren't I? It's like, oh, okay, I'm just going to do this thing for 3 minutes and see if I feel differently. And typically I do. I'm like, okay, that was not it. That was not me operating at my best. Let's do it differently. So what we're going to do is we're going to do breath of fire. Breath of fire is this active breath. It's in and out through the nose, but if you want to get a feel for it, what you would do is place a hand just below the pectoral muscles on the upper abs. You'd stick out the tongue and pant through the mouth. It's a little absurd, I'm aware, but let's just try it out. Just feel what's happening to the upper chest region as you do that. You can feel that the lungs are contracting on the exhale, and then as that chest region expands, as the diaphragm expands, the air just rushes in naturally. So the emphasis is kind of on the exhale, and then the inhale just happens kind of on its own. So we're doing the same thing, except it's through the nose. There's a few versions of this you can do. You can just sit up tall and just do breath of fire. That you're going to get some benefits that way. And then there's an even more active version, which I'm going to do, which I would encourage you to do, which is fingers curled into the pads of the hands, thumb sticking out, and then arms come up into a big V with relaxed shoulders. The eyes are closed, rolled up toward the third eye point. And then we just do it here for 3 minutes. And this really moves us from the head space into the heart space. And it's just a wonderful thing. So we're going to go here for 3 minutes. Let's begin. Just getting into any steady rhythm of breath. Doesn't need to be any specific speed. And see if you can really anchor in your attention and your focus between the eyebrows, and keep inviting the attention back to that place as you notice that you're off and away on some train of thought. Doing great. Keep going. The arms may become tired. That's a bit of the point. We're approaching the growth edge, the point where we feel like we can go no further. And yet I encourage you to just go another 10 seconds, another 20 seconds further than you think you can. Somehow it just gets easier if you just keep going. And if the arms do need to come down, that's okay. Just join back in as you feel ready. Just have another 45 seconds to go, maybe less. Last 10 seconds, keep going. And inhale deeply, sweep the arms up overhead, touch the thumbs together, extend the fingers up, stretch up, reach up. Exhale the air out. Lift the pelvic floor, squeeze rectum and sex organs, draw the energy up the spine. Inhale deeply. And as you exhale slowly, sweep the arms down to the sides. Let the hands come to rest just in the lap. Breathe comfortably. Just notice how you feel. And from this stillness, emerging as you, the real you, with no pretenses, no requirement, no performance necessary. Letting the eyes flutter open if you like, as we transition into our conversation here. Welcome. Here we are. So we are joined today. Yeah. We're joined today by Jessica Depatie for an interesting conversation. Shall see. Jessica, you do something which is called shadow work, I'm led to believe. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for guiding us through that. Everything is so much more vibrant now. And oh my gosh, I feel so blissed out. Are we seriously going to do a podcast right now?
No, I feel the same way. I feel the same way. We do these meditations and then I'm like totally relaxed. I don't even feel like talking. But Luke is like ready to go. It's so funny how that works.
I'm more familiar with the transition state. I'm like, okay, here we go, right into it. Whereas, for the first couple of years of me doing this, I was just like, let me just take 15 minutes to just enjoy this because it's something special.
This is so great. This is so great. Okay, well, first let me answer your question, then I want to say my own thing. So yeah, Jessica Depatie, and it's so fun when you transitioned us from that into this. One of your prompts was releasing anything about who you are, any preconceived notions, and then going right into, okay, tell us about yourself. And I'm like, I am a being of light. I have nothing else to say now.
I'm a formless being. I have no identity. I simply exist.
I am you. We are one.
Right. Yeah, we are each other.
Yeah. So, okay, beyond that, if I could bring some constructs back. So how I would identify myself in the human realm then is a shadow work educator and a podcaster. And I guess we could define that as, well, there are lots of ways we could define shadow work. I think a lot of us know that term from the Jungians, praise them. They have dived so deep into this work of Carl Jung, and Carl Jung is a student of so many disciplines that we're even unaware of. He was a student of Freud, who we're all probably aware of. But what a lot of people don't know is that he was a closet astrologer as well. And it was just too fringe at the time, too witchy at the time. So he morphed a lot of his teachings around science, but the man was a mystic at heart. So I study plenty of Jung, but I'm not a neo-Jungian. I could never say that. I think because I haven't gone through that schooling. But what I really focus on is more of an Eastern approach to shadow work. I'm a student of the Gene Keys specifically, and throughout that, I followed many different rabbit holes down the Eastern traditions of what it means to understand the human experience and really honor our dark nights. And also to honor that in a modern world where we can't, we may have to live in a linear format to kind of cope with the way things work. And so as much as I would love to live in Costa Rica, which I did for a while, I found myself back in the city, back to integrating myself into what the real world looks like for a lot of us. And that was really important in this journey because as we embrace our shadows, I think an important part of it is understanding how we in 2023 are a part of this, I guess you could say, like, fabric of the universe. All of this is right somehow, and all the darkness that we've been brought is right somehow. So that's a lot of what I study. In addition to that, how does play and celebration follow into? Because this can get heavy, boys. This can get really heavy, and it doesn't always have to be heavy. It can be an adventure. So yeah, that's basically what I geek out on.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, there's there's a real point of resonance there for me, because this is kind of the journey that I'm in now. I think within the last year is starting to look at, what are the ways that I'm showing up that I'm not happy with? What is the actual value of maybe some of my things I've rejected, like masculinity, like for fear of being toxically masculine, or, some, just the dark pieces. Because when I began my journey of recovery about 8 years ago, I was exposed to this technology of Kundalini yoga, which we've sampled a little bit of here today to great benefit. But within that, there's some talk, and I don't know if I just kind of interpreted the teaching this way and took it to be this way in my own, but there's this sort of self-hypnosis into goodness that is a theme there. And it's like, don't worry about the negative. Let's not focus on the negative. Let's focus on the positive, and let's just embrace the light, see yourself as a being of light, lean into that. And so I got a whole lot out of doing that for many years. And I was just like, I am good. I'm a man. I am light. Success is my elementary right. So, like, let's just let's focus on the good. Let's express the good. And I think that was a very needed transformation at the moment. But if you go too far in that realm, there's a bit of delusion as well, where it's just like, now I'm ignoring some things which are kind of an elephant in the room that I probably should address. So I see the value of this, and I have been engaged in this some form of this for the last little bit. So it's a very timely conversation for me, and I hope for others as well.
I really appreciate you saying that. I was into Kundalini for a solid, no, not solid. What am I saying? It was like a very on and off couple of years. And it was like a solid few months where I dedicated myself to a practice. Now, I never went to do this in person, but I was actually down in Costa Rica at the time. This was a couple years ago, and I discovered Guru Jagat just through online stuff. I know there's a lot of controversy around her, but she really opened my eyes to this whole realm of the technology of angles and breath. And I just found that so fascinating. And one of the most interesting things I heard her say, or actually, I think it was somebody else, part of her crew, but they were talking about how spiritual bypassing is a psyop. I was like, that's really interesting. That's really interesting to consider that spiritual bypassing is something that was created to keep people from healing. And to an extent, I do agree. That's why this work is so nuanced, because like you were saying, there's a point where processing something just isn't necessary. A lot of times it's changing our state. A lot of times it's breathing. A lot of times it's building, like what you did earlier. I think in their practice, they call it ego eradicator, which I love, because if I came into this with any kind of like tenseness around needing to present a certain way, it was definitely eradicated very quickly. And then also on the other side of that is acknowledging, okay, this is the human experience. There is an evolutionary purpose to our emotions that may be unpleasant. So what is that? What is the gold that hides in there? And so with these practices, I think it's really important for all of us to have a holistic view around what we dedicate ourselves to, what we have resolve around, and what time it's good for us. Because just like you, for me, that was so good for a little bit. And then I was like, oh, this stuff is coming up. And that means it's important. So then what is the technology that we might use, the psychotechnology we might use to understand that side of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think there is a balance to be struck as well. For some people, like for me, it's I'm trending a bit toward the light a bit too much. And then there's some people who really get fascinated with the darkness, and they want to, you know, lean into it even at times where it could just be transcended and it maybe isn't the thing to focus on. And there is just, a quicker and more painless fix to the situation than really just doubling down on negativity and diving into it real deep. So
Totally.
yeah.
If I could pass that question off to you guys, let's riff here. What do you think is the reason why some people may trend towards good vibes only, or people might trend towards that sense of melancholy and the darkness? Like, what do you think it is about those two polarities that people like to trend one way or the other?
Any thoughts, Chris?
I don't know exactly why a specific individual would trend one way or the other, but I think that it's maybe it's just like a matter of chance, and then once they're leaning in that direction, they're just simply more comfortable in that specific space of like and yeah, I think we like certainty, and that's pretty much all I got. I'll have to think on this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think for me, what's coming through is that it's whatever we've felt and experienced as one of the more impactful moments of our life is going to kind of be where we're placing the significance of what's worth leaning into in life. And so for some people, they had a very challenging upbringing. And so there was a lot of darkness, and it was very relevant at that time. And then moving forward, they're like, okay, darkness is relevant. Darkness is very important, and it's worth evaluating. And then there's people like me who, had a very wholesome and lovely upbringing, then went into kind of a dark period for about 10 years, and then had a very powerful experience of the shift that could occur when I just dropped it all and stopped paying attention to it and stopped giving it any energy and any weight, and just let myself be light and be free of it. And I'm like, oh, okay. This is what I'm interested in. So so for me, I think that's where it comes from. It's like, that was a very important and impactful moment, was it just feeling and experiencing the release of it, and how it actually, so much of it wasn't worth my intention or my energetic investment at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are both great answers. And I asked that because I haven't really thought about this either myself. So it's fun sometimes to mutually explore something, right? What I didn't mention in my intro was that I'm also a producer, and I'm working on a documentary called Dark Night of Our Soul. And part of this being in the film space and storytelling is learning a lot about movies. And in understanding a story arc, this is just like, I haven't really thought this through, but in understanding a story arc, we love the highs and the lows. We love the intoxicants, right? And I think it can be intoxicating to be obviously at your peak pleasantness, and it can be intoxicating, perhaps not the rock bottom, but like hovering on the edge. There's a sense of danger there. There's a sense of aliveness also when you go into the depths and like see stuff about yourself that you didn't know was there. And I think that as we talk about, okay, just seems like our conversation is naturally going towards, how do we balance the dark and the light? How do we flow through this human experience with grace, with whatever life brings to you and whatever you put yourself in? I think it's being a connoisseur of those intoxicants, right? Like a connoisseur of wine, for example, isn't it like putting it back? They taste, just a taste of everything can be just enough. So I think that may be an interesting contemplation for anybody listening, is when just a taste of the depth may be enough for you, you can bring that back to neutrality and work with that. When just a taste of pleasantness may be enough for you, that's really interesting there, because that can make anything pleasant. It can be like, oh, I'm so grateful for this pen that works. These little things that we take for granted can be really beautiful. And I think that is at least my goal with my personal life, is to find more gratitude in those mundane moments. So I'm not seeking, because girl, I'm a seeker. I love a big experience. So to work with that, I need to understand how these itty bitty peaks can feel more like more.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And there's something a teacher said to me at one point, I think it was Tommy Rosen. He said, you need to fall in love with the subtle, because his work deals with people who have experienced addiction, like myself. And addictions want impact, or addicts want impact. They want something that really hits and like feels big. But leaning into these, the more subtle, minute pieces of life can be very rich. We can amplify the experience through our own interaction with it, through just paying more attention to it. And you can do this anytime you want. You can look at a tree and you can be like, oh, a tree. Yeah, how about that? Or you can just let your eyes go a little glossy and just be like, that's a beautiful pattern on the foliage. Or like, look at that movement in the wind. It's like, there's actually more to everything if we give it a bit more of our own attention and we infuse our consciousness into it.
Absolutely. I think that the addiction conversation is very, very interesting, because while I haven't had an addiction that on paper would seem like an addiction, I feel like an addict at heart. When I find something I like, I'm like, yes, more of that. Another form of addiction that may be less on the nose, but is just as well a form of addiction as finding one thing and going back and back and back to it, even though it's not fulfilling, is what I think the majority of at least the Western world experiences, which is diverting from thing to thing. I'm going to have this drink. Oh, it didn't do it. So I'm going to go watch some Netflix. That didn't do it. So I'm going to go see if I can find a new partner. That didn't do it. It's like, there's no recovery program for somebody that's just going from thing to thing. That's become normalized. So exactly. I really think that, like, if we can all acknowledge that we have some addict vibes, I think that's really helpful, because that's the power of this type of shadow work that I subscribe to. There's always a gift within every shadow. So what are the positive qualities that come from having addictive patterns? Well, it means that you desire adventure. You desire, like what you were saying, the awe, the bigness, the excitement, which can be challenging in this time where we have access to our phones. And let's say like children, right? As a kid, before real widespread use of the internet, like I'm 35. So I had some internet going on, but not to the extent that people do now with like VR and all these things. To see the Grand Canyon, you have to go to the Grand Canyon. And, now, I mean, sure, the Grand Canyon, once you're there, it's like no picture can ever really do it for you, but you can also pull it up on your computer screen. And so I feel like for kids these days, and even just one generation younger than me, the sense of awe is really hard to come by, because we have access to everything. You can see anything that you want to see from the four walls of your home. So the strategy of moving from addiction into adventure as a gift is exactly what you're saying, like appreciating the subtle. I forget how you said it exactly. What was the quote?
You need to fall in love with the subtle.
Fall in love with the subtle, right? We could spend a lifetime analyzing a square inch of dirt outside of our homes, right? Like there's a lifetime of study there. We think that we have to go travel and do all these big things. Like really everything is all right here.
That's so good. Yeah, I just want to explore something that you were saying there. And I think it ties into even your share before this one. It's just this, like, becoming a connoisseur of the intense emotions, or like the amplifying emotions, or whether they be positive or negative. That's the fine art that a person can perfect within themselves. And if you have tools of consciousness, be they some form of yoga practice or meditation, like you can really help yourself in this way. to have a strong center that you can return to, so that you can visit excitement and return to contentment, or you can visit amplification and intensity and return to contentment. It's like that's that rebounding effect that's really important. And so much of like our mind tricks us, and that's really the crux of addiction, is people think that there's some linear relationship between you and whatever it is you're engaging with, so that the first bit of satisfaction is going to then happen again in the same ratio as you go on, but it doesn't. That's the chasing the dragon sort of mentality, where the first bit happens, you experience shift. Everyone wants shift. Everyone wants to feel different. That's why they bounce from one thing to the next. It's like that shift is satisfying, but that shift doesn't really happen the same way again. That's why one drink isn't the same. The difference from one drink to two drinks isn't the same as from 2 to 3 or from 5 to 6. It's like it changes. Part of that's our biochemistry. Part of that is just, you know, the way that we're seeing and experiencing it as being different or same. So becoming masters of this ability to hold ourselves to account, to say, I'm going to establish myself here, and then I'm going to have an experience. And then I'm going to come back. Then I'm going to have another experience. And then I'm going to come back. I think that's a beautiful life.
Absolutely.
I
I know
think
we're talking
addiction.
about, oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Okay. I think addiction is the water like the Western world swims in to a great extent. And once you see it, it's kind of hard to unsee it. Once you reframe addiction as not just hard drugs, perhaps Luke, you could provide us like the definition Tommy uses.
Yeah, Tommy says addiction is any behavior that you continue to do despite the fact it brings negative consequences into your life.
Right.
Well,
So that really applies to any human. We all do that.
Yeah, exactly. And you can just observe people like bouncing from one addiction to another, like whether it's cigarettes, and then you pull out your phone, and then you go on YouTube, and then you have a drink, and then you go on Tinder, and then you go on Netflix, and then, you know, it's just like one thing after another, like that didn't do it, now to the next thing. And I'm reminded of the quote that like man's problems come from the inability to sit in a room for 20 minutes and just do nothing. So where was I going with that? The work that, you know, Luke is doing is like helping people with addiction. And once you kind of break out of that, it's pretty awesome, because then you can actually start to like look closely at a tree or a table or the floor, or the sky, and you're not interrupted by these compulsions to pull out your phone, or even the addiction to like emotional volatility is like perhaps the most insidious one. And like just you're like engaging all kinds of thinking that is provoking yourself, and you can kind of get addicted to these thoughts about shit that happened in the past, or like shit that you think is going to happen in the future, and you're just that can be an addiction there, but nobody really thinks of that as addiction. They think about opioids.
Right.
I'm reminded of something. This is a thought I had a long time ago, a couple of years ago, but I was just thinking about, you know, television shows and how they all involve drama, and there's always some form of problem that needs to be addressed. There's some like crisis, like every episode. That's just the classic story arc. Is things are going great, then there's a crisis, things get a little bad, and then they need to reach the resolution. I'm paraphrasing it. There's some arc that I'm glossing over, but there's some crisis that needs to be addressed. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if there was a show where a whole bunch of people just interacted amicably and lovely, and then they're like goodbye and good night.
That's what we're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of are doing that right now. But I've met some people. I'm meeting more and more people who are doing this, who kind of need like a balm or a salve on their life, and they use Full House, or they use like some 80s like sitcom, which is kind of pleasant, to just end their day, or, you know, they incorporate that as just a way to be like, I just need something pleasant and calming and grounding that isn't actually this drama filled experience of a heightening and amplification.
Oh my gosh, I relate to that so much. My balm is Harry Potter. When I'm having a hard day, a Harry Potter audiobook comes on, I'm like, everything is right in the world. Also, a weird thing that comes up for me around the balm, like I've never heard it put that way, I love that, is the grocery store. So being an entrepreneur, I find that I like there's a lot of working, there's a lot of going for it, there's a lot of newness. And in that newness is fear around, is this going to work? You know, am I making the right decision? Am I learning from the right sources? All these things. And so when I'm in those seasons, I find that there's just a fantastic grocery store here called Central Market here in Austin. And I have yet to go to it because I have been in one of those seasons now because it's just new. So I keep going to the Sprouts that's too far away because I know where everything is. And it's like I don't have the emotional safety to go to a new grocery store. Like, that's very interesting. To me, that shadow work, as non-remarkable as that is, it's just the noticing and the awareness that comes from these decisions that, like you were saying, I wouldn't say it's an addiction to Sprouts, but it's definitely, there's a better option that I'm not doing for whatever reason, like staying in what's comfortable. That shadow work, it is so uninteresting at points, but that is like real world spirituality, you know.
That is real world spirituality.
To your point about the movie or the film around people just like hanging out and being amicable, I'm putting together a podcast right now around this specifically, more or less, and did some research in understanding our current story structure and why people in the West really love the hero's journey, because that's what we're seeing there. When we need like some bomb to go off, and then there needs to be a redemption or some kind of conquering, and then bringing back this elixir into the real world. Like, we just assume that this is the way stories work. Well, I think you might find this kind of interesting. So this really goes back to the patriarchy. And this goes way, way back into when humans were first developing, you know, when we had low brows and sunken in eyes and, you know, bats and swinging women around by their hair, right? It started at this point where we were at that point one with nature, because our prefrontal cortex hadn't developed to the point where we felt any separateness. Just like a deer might be in a field, it uses the grass as part of its survival, right? It uses the grass and the light as part of its ability to thrive. It doesn't see it as different. It doesn't worship it. It just is. So it works with it. And then we go into a different phase of evolution where we start to feel our separateness from it. We start to worship the land and the water because we recognize our own mortality at that point, right? Our ability to understand that we are going to not exist, and this hope and this wish that we will exist longer becomes important to us. So we start to worship the land and tend the land. But then at a certain point, we get into the Iron Age, and this is where things get really interesting. We start to get greater access to tools to till the land, and we start to be able to dominate it. And through that, we can farm better, clearly, and our population grows, and our societal complexity really gets pretty complex. But through that, our neurology has changed in a way that, I wouldn't say neurology, our psyche has changed in a way that we feel we can dominate the earth. But the thing that we can't dominate is the sun. The sun comes when it wants to come. We don't have any tools to manage if there's going to be a drought or not. We don't have the tools to understand how the seasons may be shorter or longer. So we start to praise the sun, and we go from this polytheistic, in general, this polytheistic species into a monotheistic, sun worshiping kind of species, the he. And the whole show attempts to understand what the patriarchy really is beyond gender roles and gender constructs, and understand how this works into how we do things now. So how this is relevant to this conversation is when we look at the hero's journey. That is very much a narrative of our psyche from the Iron Age, where the hero, and we're all heroes in our own stories, we're like playing out this long, complex plot where we play the good guy in our own lives, whether that is reality or not, kind of irrelevant. But at a certain point, the hero has to conquer the monster, has to vanquish the chaos, has to bring order to something that's really trying to shake stuff up. And the monster, whether it's a dragon, a serpent-headed woman, that is the guise of the Great Mother. You know, she is the chaos that's brought into the organic experience to create more growth on the other side. But our narratives taught us we must vanquish it. And upon vanquishing it, we are gifted with treasures and awards and power and love and belonging. So I don't think, full circle, I don't think that with our current way of understanding what it means to live a successful hero story, a show like that would work, because that's how you find belonging, is by like conquering. Anyway.
You're gonna have to re-listen to this podcast to understand that. But yeah, definitely a lot of interesting thoughts I'm having there. And one is I want to go back to when you talked about the difference between like a deer and a human, and a deer maybe doesn't recognize itself as separate from the grass, but a human, we recognize our own mortality. And what I think that is we create our own mortality in our head just by creating ourselves as a finite symbol. And from that, mortality arises. That the illusion of separateness, I suppose, is what I'm getting at.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've been recently studying the Maya from the Hindu religion.
Yes. And
this was a newer concept for me to dive into, but I found it fascinating. For anybody who's listening who doesn't know what that is, it's the illusion, it's literally the illusion of separateness. And we may, on the surface, demonize that and want to go back to a sense of oneness and connectedness. But if we go back to this, if we can subscribe to all of this is right, like we've evolved for a reason, it's a really interesting thing to contemplate. Like, why does the Maya exist? What is the evolutionary purpose, more or less, of that to exist? And Kali, who also works into the system, right? If we're talking about death and destruction as being part of the human experience, it's clear for us to stave that off as often as possible, right? Like, I can get Amazon delivered to my home so I can stay safe in here, right? I can get food delivered practically into my mouth now. Like, there is not a lot of chaos that's happening on the surface, but with all of these conveniences, that is still a part of us. And so we create a lot of this, excuse my language, like pointless bullshit to create our own chaos, because it's like we know that destruction needs to be part of our process, which whether that's conscious or not. So I think that's where a lot of this infighting comes from. That's why politics goes this route. Unnecessary gossip, like gossip absolutely has its purpose at some points, but all this unnecessary stuff that I think Kundalini really helps get us out of is a real thing. Because at a certain point, too much order starts to become tyrannical, and that's when the Black Madonna comes in and shakes it up for all of us. So just my last point on that is the spiritual experience for a lot of us. I can speak for myself here. I want the spiritual experience to be blissed out. I want it to be that day after ayahuasca feeling. Like, I want it to be this constant elevation. But we do this work long enough, we know that God gives us all these challenges in order to grow. So it is like, how can we embrace the dark without pushing it aside and pretending it doesn't exist? Because in real life, sometimes it looks like the grocery store that you just don't want to go to.
Yeah, I'm wondering if some of this, like the necessary destruction, as you put it, the Kali aspect, like is that finding form in a lot of people's life in this kind of, combativeness with other people, or it's like people who may not have necessarily developed the capacity to empty out their own cup through some techniques like Kundalini yoga, where you're just kind of, instead of just accumulating and accumulating and accumulating, you're actually letting go of some stuff. You're
Mm.
actually clearing it out. I think people who maybe are taking in more and more, and we live in a world of incredible sensory input right now where we're taking in a lot, they may, if they don't have the skills to empty internally, they may try to destroy externally because they're like, this is too much. We need less things. There needs to be less going on. And so some version of that is, tearing somebody down, or, some sort of combative situation or some form of destruction externally. Just postulating that, but that may be what we're seeing.
I fully subscribe to that. Absolutely. Like that is actually my life's work, at least at the moment. The goal, the aim of the documentary is to eventually help people understand that the systems that we are a part of, let me back up. When we look at documentaries on Netflix, let's say, a social impact documentary specifically, we can see a list very clearly of all of the issues that are going on, right? We have environmental issues, we have economic issues, we have societal issues, we have all these issues. So why is that? If we're so smart and we have access to so much and people are so passionate, it seems people are so passionate about innovation and helping people more or less, then what is happening right now? Well, it seems like the easiest answer is unresolved traumas, right? The answer seems, and if we were to say that like more gently, it's what you were talking about there. The distortion within us has no other option to other than to distort what we are creating. So instead of, me growing up, I was too aware of all these issues to the point where I thought I was going to go crazy, if I'm honest with you. I was so sensitive to the haves and the have-nots and this wide gap. And it affected me emotionally. And so instead of trying to, go zero waste, which almost there with the kitchen, but like it's a hard thing to do. Instead of tackling race issues, which is really complex, instead of tackling all these things, they felt very surface to me. So what could be my greatest form of service seemed to help people understand their inner world, so that, because to me, that seems like it may be the only significant positive legacy that we can leave for generations beyond us. Because like you were saying, there is a reason why people in power are there. There's often a hole in their hearts that's being filled with validation, external validation. So to have that endurance to push through a lot of these walls really requires this laser focus on something. And if that something is, I need validation, I need love from somebody else. So I'm going to start finger pointing because this group really, like, the community really does that. And to be accepted into it, I'm going to also do that. I'm going to amplify it. So kind of losing my train of thought here. What I see in the next 20 years, if all goes as planned, is a creation of a new type of advocacy, a new type of activist that looks a lot different than the ones we're seeing now. The ones we see now create a lot of division. And that's okay, because that's part of it. That's part of that pendulum swing. We need to see all of the stuff. And sometimes that requires screaming, and sometimes that requires yelling to see, look at me, look at us, we exist, some form of that. And then at a certain point, that doesn't work anymore. At some point, they are seen, and there needs to be a uniting element to it. So I think we're really on the edge of that finger pointing being necessary and going into this new era of what does unity look like if it's not sameness? Because clearly we're not all the same, nor do we want to be. We shouldn't all agree with each other. That's what gives flavor to life. So what is unity and diversity? How can that really work? And how can we be like harbingers of a hope, heart-opening form of advocacy that still has the same kind of impact without the picketing and all that, the looting and whatnot.
That's amazing. Thank you for expressing that so eloquently. Yeah, I think I have felt that that same sensation. So many issues that get widely amplified right now. It's like, yes, I agree with what you're saying, but the way that you're doing it is kind of just look at me, there's a problem, we're not solution oriented here. This is just look at the problem. And it's like, yes,
Right.
look at the problem, step one. Now hopefully we are switching into something which is more constructive in nature, and we're actually building something where we can all exist with our heterogeneous nature, where we're not just amalgamating and becoming one thing, which I'm sure would be easier to control from a top-down thing, but that's not going to happen.
Sure. Hmm.
It's so much more satisfying, and yes, it is the spice and variety of life for everyone to support each other by being different. And you get to walk up to someone and they get to surprise you, instead of just meeting the same person and having the same conversation again and again. Like that's no kind of way to live. I lived that way for a little while, but that was kind of my own doing.
Oh, sure. I mean,
Creating that
it's always our
that
own
paradigm.
doing. This whole conversation seems very Aquarian to me. Are you guys into astrology at all?
A little bit, just through,
Okay.
well, in Kundalini yoga they talk about the Aquarian age and how we're in it now. So
Yeah.
my knowledge is shallow, but maybe you can flesh it out a little bit.
So one of the cool things about the Aquarian archetype is it is it's like valuing individuality and weirdness, and at the same time valuing how your weirdness fits into community. So it's at the same time being very like tribe and community and like humanitarian oriented, while also recognizing the weird in everybody and the uniqueness in everyone. It's also a very strange thing to dance between, right? Because you think of individual as one thing and you think of community as another thing, but this archetype brings them together. And another reason why this conversation is very Aquarian is because addiction also plays into, it's a classic Aquarian trait where they almost like need a very deep spiritual practice, excuse me, because this world at times doesn't feel like it makes sense. Because living on the knife's edge of that polarity is not usually the status quo. You're either one or the other. You're an individual or you're a relationship person, you're a community person. And so like they want to get to a higher state. So if it's not through spirituality, then it can be through drugs or through Netflix or whatever other kind of addiction. So this is all like really cool through line around distraction being a prescription with lots of side effects for this thing that I think is calling out to all of us right now in the Aquarian age. And I don't know anything about the Aquarian age, like when it started, what it means or anything, but if I were to just guess based on what we're talking about here, the level of distraction has become so great. And if we are all, and the technology is all part of this master plan, then why? Like one has to wonder, why is this all here? How is all of this part of the divine plan? Part of shadow work is to understand that this is a sign, like this disease, this disintegration, this separation is all a form of awareness. It's all like the pre-verbal dissonance that we get right before we transform. And if we keep ignoring the dissonance, if we keep ignoring the discord and that feedback when two vibrations don't match, then we'll keep hovering in that until the universe pantses us and kicks us into the lake, kicks us into the dark night. So I think a lot of the shadow work can be very proactive if we subscribe to this all being a sign of transformation, all being part of it.
Yeah, it's been such a helpful thing for me to adopt that perspective that nothing is wrong. The externals, like society, all of these things, there's many things you can point to and be like, that's not going so great. Like that's not going so great. And then maybe if you pay attention to too much, or if you follow different streams of information, you can trend toward pessimism. But you can always anchor yourself in the knowledge that nothing is wrong. It's like all of this is Maya, all of this is illusion. If it is being building towards something, then it must be up to something constructive ultimately, even though if that involves some destructive elements. And yeah, my very limited understanding of what the Aquarian age is that 2011, I think, was when it kind of started to shift, maybe 2013, something like that. But it's a bit of a shift in people from being so information oriented to being a bit more consciousness oriented. So not just using knowledge to advance us in a technical way, but using our beingness to connect us in a much more holistic way, where we actually begin to feel and experience other humans as being real, and we're not just concerned with progress, we're concerned with connection.
That is so cool, because Aquarius also represents media. It also represents technology and innovation, and like short form media actually is what Aquarius also stands for. So if we were to subscribe to our shadows always having a gift, it makes sense that our technology has just crazy boomed in the last decade, and that being our awakening moment, that there's more to it than technology. So to understand that, we needed to see the impact of what technology can do. Good or bad.
It had to kind of run rampant, so that we were like, okay, we don't just need more and more and more of this, because we've reached a point where maybe it is already too much, and now we need to shift gears into finding humans and touching the earth, and like not just building bigger and bigger farming machines, but planting a garden ourselves and growing like 2 tomato plants and finding out how amazing that is.
Yeah, I think TikTok is probably the opposite of yoga. And one thing that changed my perspective on yoga is when I heard that the word yoga means union. And so it's directionally toward union, all these various activities in yoga, more than just stretching. But TikTok is, and to be clear, when I say TikTok, I refer to the model of like 5-second videos that you scroll with. So whether it's Reels or Snapchat or whatever Facebook has, it's all pretty much the same thing. It's just that TikTok has like no ethics around addictivity, and like they're willing to addict you to the max, and they got really good at it. So TikTok is literally just like segregated 5-second videos, and you're like context switching like rapidly, just getting like one little dopamine hit after another, and it's very disjointed. It's not like the first 5-second video has anything to do with the next one, and so it's the opposite of union. And it's not even real. It's like, I like to think of electricity as like a ghost. Like the things on the screen have really no substance behind them. We don't even know. It's funny, like perhaps in the early days of the internet, like everything you saw was like represented like a real place. Like, but now with like AI and Photoshop and like animation and everything, it's like now there's really nothing behind it.
But there could be a lesson there. Maybe this is a lesson that people can extract in that, as we're able to recognize more and more that these things that we're seeing and engaging with are not real, we can start to stop attributing so much value to them. We can stop attributing so much value to the thoughts that we have as being real. Because I know that I was very attached to my thoughts as being real for 28 years of my life. And then I finally encountered the piece of knowledge, which was, I don't need to give weight to every thought that I have. This is not necessarily me. This is an option. This is something being presented for my appraisal. So as we can scale back that involvement, we may be able to develop some sort of balanced attachment to living, where we have a strong...
Something tells me you're not on TikTok.
I have never used TikTok.
It's kind of like the biggest public health disaster of the 21st century, I'd say. perhaps it'll play out and be recognized as a bigger public health disaster than COVID. That's to be determined. But right now, it's not thought of as that. I mean, maybe there's a few people talking about it, but yeah, we still haven't seen the full effects of the smartphoneification of our youth, and yeah, it's like all of us, like we didn't grow up with iPhones, right? So, but the kids being born today, my gut tells me that we're gonna then see how that affects the development of the mind and the kind of I suspect it depletes the reservoirs of contentment if you're constantly seeing things that aren't even real. And anyways, it's to be determined, but I think, yeah, it's like I've said this for a long time. I think like iPhones can be worse than cigarettes. So we'll see if my hypothesis is right.
I mean, yeah, if I could add on to that, even something as simple as using a maps function on your phone can be really detrimental to your brain. Like they're seeing that the parts of our brains that are that help us orient to where we are really atrophying right now, because like we pull up our phones to find every place. You don't necessarily look for landmarks, and it brings your awareness out of trying to orient yourself to the planet to then just being on this, following this little line. Like when I was in LA a couple years ago, I was with a friend and I was looking for actually kind of on point, like red light bulbs to counteract the blue. And we were at a Target and he pulls up his app on his phone in a Target to find the thing. It's like, oh, you don't just walk around and find these things anymore? Like, where have I been living? And he's like, yeah, it's on aisle C17. I'm like, this feels wrong. This is not okay.
This is too late.
But then to like Luke's point, also, we also don't know what side of history we're on. Like, it brings me back, this conversation always brings me back to something like Jesus Christ and Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate, clearly the bad guy in that story at that time. But if he didn't exist, would we have this, if he was a real person or not, kind of not the point, but would we have this great master who lived the story that we can live through? It's almost like he needed to exist to martyr himself in a strange backwards way to gift us with a really beautiful like way of life, this beautiful archetype that we can embody. So I'll be the first one to say Jeff Bezos, like, and also when I'm at a point of neutrality, it's like, okay, he's part of it. This is all kind of part of it. But that is one of the tricky things though with this. And I don't know how to resolve this. I think this is more of an energetic thing, but how can we live while acknowledging that things need to change and we need to put effort towards an ideal of something greater, whatever our monkey brains might assume that is, and dedicate our lives to being of service to people, and also sit in joy that this is the human experience and that it's not all wrong. Yeah, like Luke, you were saying, it's a very funny place to stay within.
Yeah, I think like it's for me, like it's much more fun to like have the the boogeyman and like ascribe like the evil forces, like I could lean into like everything's neutral, everything's fine, like positivity, and we can, if there's a lesson in everything, but it's like if I don't know, like I'd rather in my life have like the thing that I decide is bad, and like that is what I rail against, and I get to like unleash my energy against the evil forces of TikTok. And like at the end of the day, like I that's more fun, like having the drama. Like
well, I
recognize that like everything's neutral and blah blah blah, but I'd rather have the drama, I guess, like to an extent.
I think it's possible to have both. I think it's possible to have both in that we can cultivate within ourselves this balanced attachment to outcome, and we can see that or we can lean into the idea that perhaps everything's unfolding in a pretty good way. But that doesn't just mean that we like become this passive observer of our life and take no actions. Like, no, we get to be a player in the Maya. We get to take a role on the stage, and we get to actually do things. So if you decide, hey, I want to be the guy who really starts a large movement of against like pocket smartphones, I want to shift like, the youth back to engaging with the dirt. It's like that's what I'm doing. But you can kind of see, you can not take yourself so seriously in so doing it, because you can just feel that it's inevitable. You're like, it's inevitable that this is going to work. This is already happening. This is already working. Now I'm not pushing and forcing it, being like, I must stop these heathens. Instead, it's just
sometimes it's like just super fun to do that.
Although, yeah, I mean, have some fun with it. Why not?
So if I could add to that, back when I think it was 2020 when Black Lives Matter was really like coming to the forefront, one of the things that I wanted to understand was, okay, what is happening here? Just period. What's going on right now? And there's a lot of awareness around race issues. And I think this is relevant in this conversation because this would be like a different arena where we can be like, there is a bad guy and it's society, it's all these things that are creating the systems that make it hard for certain of color to progress. Okay. But the amount of finger pointing, I was like, okay, wait, hold up. Like, I'm feeling a red flag here. Because clearly racism is bad. Like, I don't need to say that. But also, how are we more alike to the people that, how are we more similar to the people that we're deeming as just total shitheads compared to us who are not racist, right? And so in my contemplation around that, I came to, okay, the reason why someone may be racist, okay, is, and I haven't formulated like a thing around TikTok yet, but so this is just my best attempt to find some similarity in that. The reason why someone might be racist is because they dislike people that are different. Okay. That's like the easiest way to put it. Now we look at the rest of the population, a lot of us are afraid of being different. So doesn't that also imply in some way that we are, by being afraid of being different, we also dislike people that are different? We see difference as something negative. And by being different, I mean like quitting your 9-to-5 and becoming whatever you want, a puppeteer, or not having children or not doing all the things that you should, right? It's not as dramatic as hating Black people, but there's a lot of similarity there around this like shadow of division and like differentness. And
yeah, well, black and white, they define each other. Like, you can't have the black without the white. So we look for something different to define ourselves. And then when we go out and look for a boogeyman to create some drama in our life, we're obviously gonna look for something different than us. Like, that's, to have a boogeyman, it has to be something foreign, and we don't want to attack ourselves, obviously. So we define something as totally different and separate and bad and evil, and we can ascribe all kinds of badness onto them, really probably just projecting.
Totally.
And,
yeah.
yeah.
It's just a representation. It's like we find a scapegoat to be our representation of what's happening in our internal world collectively. So like Hitler wouldn't do so well now. Just some random guy standing up and being like, all these things, people would be like, that's insane. He'd probably live on the side of the street, and like nobody be listening. But back in that time, the collective consciousness, they had this ideal. There were problems going on, and there was this one guy that was just like right place, right time for that ideal, that then he was, I would say, scapegoat in a way, but he was like the face of a collective consciousness, so that's where
energy built up around that time in, post World War I Germany. They totally got screwed, and like they were living in hell basically in post World War I Germany. And then Hitler was really the mouthpiece that enabled all of that energy to then flow into World War II, which was really just an extension of World War I. And just going back to Black Lives Matter, I mean, think about when that happened. It was right around the lockdowns around COVID. There's like a lot of suffering going on around that. People super high anxiety, especially in like the more liberal cities where the lockdowns are pretty hardcore. I was in Portland at the time. It was like, yeah, pretty hardcore lockdowns. And then all of a sudden there's all these people on the streets like rioting about Black Lives Matter. And it's like, well, I wonder where all this energy is coming from. Maybe it's because you've been locked in your house for 6 months.
Yeah, well, the scapegoating is just one of the oldest government or governmental tactics in the book. It's always don't direct your anger toward the institution, direct it towards something parallel to you. And so it's been encouraged by most authoritarian structures forever, because it just gives people an outlet for their frustrations. But
Yeah,
typically, racism or any sort of dislike of an outgroup fades away if the two people can actually have a meeting and speak to one another and connect. Like even some of the more hardcore white supremacists, if they actually, like, most of them have never really had a conversation with a black person. It's just like hasn't happened. And if they do, then they're like, oh, you're a human, right? Like, I was dehumanizing you. It's like, if we're actually seeing people as the same as us, then we can't do that. So, but it's an easy out. It's a way to, channel that energy so it doesn't get turned internal or destructive, or it's also a way of shirking responsibility for your life. Because if you have a good boogeyman, as you say, then you don't have to admit that you are actually the most powerful being in your existence, and that you have the most authority to do and change your circumstances. You're not just subject to everything that happens to you. You can reclaim that if you want it. And yes, there will be challenge. And yes, it's incredibly a challenging starting point for many, many people, but it's still you. Nobody can do it for you. So get to it.
I was just gonna say, like, maybe it's worth noting that the strategy like the government used, at least that I saw, was actually not to really combat the energy and like the rioting and stuff. They just kind of let it burn out. Like they just let the chaos happen, and then eventually like downtown got destroyed, and then it was over. It was like they let the person, or like they let that group energy just kind of go through its process, and they just kind of like let the mob see it through. And I don't know, it's just interesting to me to see. Like, I don't know, I'm not saying that was like a good strategy or bad strategy, but I think we could bring it back to like when we create a boogeyman, like see it through, attack that boogeyman, and then get all that energy out, and then you might end up just sitting down with a black person and saying, oh, okay, they're not the boogeyman. I'm gonna go find a new big boogeyman. Maybe it's TikTok or whatever.
I think, just to double down on what I said earlier, I think the way through a lot of this is to see and experience directly. So if someone is saying like, this person's a racist, this person's terrible, don't listen to this guy, it's like, look at them directly. Stop listening to everyone who's talking about that person. Have a moment with that being, make an assessment for yourself, and then go from there. It's like, have direct contact with as many things as you can, so that you have actual real knowing, as opposed to just being shaped by a lot of different forces that would be interested in you thinking one way or another about things.
Yeah, I love the idea of just seeing it through. Like just keep going further. Like go further with like your ideas, your hypotheses of the world. Just go all the way to the end. Like, okay, you really, like, if you believe something, just keep investigating it further and further.
Well, there's a reason why certain things pull at our heartstrings. There's like a lot of stuff going on, and we're not always affected by them, but there are certain things that do. Like, Chris, what's one thing? Okay, so you can say TikTok, but if another thing comes to your mind, like, what is something that you're just like, like, this really is bothering me about society?
Oh man, I mean, it's easier to look at like my past selves and say like I was really bothered by climate, or I was really bothered by wealth inequality, or I was yeah, really bought like so many things. I would say the school system, like perhaps that is one thing that still bothers me to this day, that it's so antiquated and it could be so much better, but it's not.
Yeah. So I think like when we talk about, we haven't talked about this yet, but what comes up for me is like a sense of purposelessness is a thing right now that a lot of people feel. And not everyone can be a life coach. Not everyone can do a form of service as their career that like really fulfills them on that heartstring level. Maybe we'll get to a point where that will be possible, but just right now, people work in offices and stuff like that, and that's perfectly great. So I think it's like really helpful to, like you were saying, identify those things that really pull at your heartstrings and then make it an inside job first. So understand, what is it about my life, my past personal experiences that have made this really important to me? And I think that can open up a lot of inner work prior to us going out to battle the thing that it represents. And it's almost like if we all stopped using single-use plastics, we would change, the whole way businesses run their businesses, right? Like it just wouldn't be an option anymore. But to do it as a single person, it seems like I'm not going to make a difference if I go zero waste, for example. But I think that is really, unfortunately, our only option is for every individual to like look at why these issues are impacting them and figure it out within themselves, because that will then ripple outwards. Like I think the next generations are just set up more for this than we are. We live in this liminal space, I think, where we came off of excuse me, millennials specifically. We're coming sorry. Excuse me. We're coming off of like, what was the generation before us? Like Gen X, who is like office goers. They're in this last paradigm of success being the thing, which was cool. That was their thing. And the millennials came in, we were like, we are not willing to punch our card just for the sake of a paycheck. We haven't figured out how that's going to work yet, but we just don't like it as much. And so we've crafted this real like appreciation for philanthropy and service being our currency. Now that has its issues too, because philanthropy can also be a form of power and stuff like that. But anyway, what I'm getting at is this next generation, I think, is seeing all of the successes from previous generations and where we fell short and where we really like changed the game in great ways. And I think they're set up to just hold more information than we are. I think we can see that with the whole gender construct conversation. I don't know too much about it. That really isn't my world, but I'm observing it as, wow, this is super, super new to me. This is very interesting. I'm not fully like jumping on board to say that I understand it or to say that it's right or wrong or anything like that. But it's just like a really interesting thing that people are sitting in, this mishmash of everything is kind of okay. How do you guys feel about that? You know what I mean? There isn't really a question there. Just sorry. It's just where my mind went.
Maybe this is like a good opportunity, just since we have limited time. So you talked about how there's kind of that old model of work where you punch in every day and you're part of a corporation, and I think you know what I'm getting at. But it's starting to shift. We're kind of on this frontier of this new way of working, and this new form of producing and being of service. And I think you're a good example of that. You're someone who's taken an untraditional path, and it takes a lot of courage to do that. It's still very much the norm to punch in and out, right? But myself and Luke and you, we're all doing this new form of work where you're independently working, but you have like kind of like partners and like kind of like an online network, and you're able to get things done. Like you're making a movie, and like I watched the first 20 minutes of your movie, and it's pretty amazing to see that someone is able to just decide, I'm going to make this happen. Like me and my partner, like I don't think you had a career in Hollywood before that.
No.
So do you want to tell us more about that?
Yes, thank you. So we touched on a lot of the themes throughout this, but basically the documentary explores the evolutionary purpose of trauma. And we take basically this seems like it's a mental health conversation, but it really isn't. It's really a conversation around consciousness. So the current mental health narrative is either, it's at worst like getting stuck in your traumas and identifying with it, or at best medicating it away or forgetting about your past or getting over it. And those are two really interesting solutions to something that is a part of the human experience. Hard stuff happens, and still we've been screaming at the skies forever, why do bad things happen to good people? Like, why is this happening to me? So we really want to address that question. If it doesn't matter where you come from, how much money you have, what kinds of parents you have, everybody has something that's happened to them that was too much too soon, and we were different on the other side of it. We got locked up a little bit, or we lost a piece of ourselves. Or on the flip side, there was a form of neglect, not enough for too long, and we lost our sense of importance or belonging. So if that exists for everyone at different levels of intensity, then there must be a reason why it exists. So we start off the film in really understanding the bioevolutionary context of why chaos must occur, why death must occur. It's a depersonification of post-traumatic growth in nature, which we already covered a little bit. The easiest example is if we want to grow our muscles, we need to break them down a little bit, and then they come back more resilient. The same thing happens to our psychology. But in knowing that we have really separated ourselves from nature, even the definition of nature in the dictionary is anything on this planet, basically, except for humans. It's like, what? That's interesting. Talk about a psyop, right? So we've tried to like separate ourselves from the Kali energy, from death and destruction. We've been very successful at staving off death. Literally, we're living a lot longer. Death in childbirth isn't really so much of an issue in the Western world. So, but still, our psychological traumas continue to come with us. We live in a society where we value rationality and logic, but there's clearly not a lot of logic and common sense happening when you look around at the reality of the situation. Way over consuming, way too much distraction, not enough connection, not enough love, not enough vulnerability. So the goal of the documentary is, one, to help us see everybody has trauma and it's fine. You don't have to identify with it. It's a thing. It's distorting your reality. And also defining what is growth then, because a lot of us in this industry, for lack of a better word, self-development, we talk about growth a lot. So that was a real challenge for us, because growth isn't, if it's not success and it's not achievement, because a lot of us have that, and that doesn't seem to be the whole thing, then what is it? Well, we use that word because it's the scientific name of what we're talking about. It's the flip side to PTSD, but it really should be, instead of growth, it should be a deepening, because I think that's what we're really looking for when we talk about growth. It's a deepening into our human experience. It's to feel everything and to approach it with grace, to feel the depths and to sit there and to not be like, I can't wait to get out of here, to know that this is part of it. I've been praying for transformation. I've been praying to break through the system, through my own blocks, through my own ceiling. Help me do that, God. And it's like, okay, well, in order to do that, something has to die. Some of this stuff has to be ripped away. And if you're not going to do it proactively, I'm going to help you. I'm going to do it for you, So that's where we see people like getting divorced and deaths in the family and, these things that seem like just shitty happenstance. But it's an invitation to growth. It's the invitation to the thing that we've been praying for.
Time to die, time to be reborn.
Right.
So,
and then we end off with the whole point of this, though, really is growth being this expansion of consciousness, right? Being able to see our lives from multiple different perspectives. But then why? Does this go beyond being a very well self-serving way of experiencing more in life as the individual? Absolutely not. Because if we can all grow or we can all deepen, that leaves a much clearer experience for the people that come after us or the people that are around us, period. We make better decisions. We had touched on this before. We make better decisions. We just seeing somebody as the divine being they are can change everything. And so this is really actually a bit of a controversial aspect of it, growth being a moral responsibility. You know, if we have any responsibility, because we don't know what side of history we're on, we can attach ourselves to a lot of great ideals, but we don't really know what's going to be good and what's going to be bad, you know, for lack of a better word. But what we do know is if we can expand our consciousness, that will change everything. So if we can just focus on that, that will resolve a lot of the stuff we were talking about.
So yeah, just the way that you're talking about this so elegantly, I can tell it's been your reality like for many years, learning about this and thinking about this. And I don't know exactly what your like experiences with like post-traumatic stress, but in my experience, perhaps a better name would be post-traumatic mess.
I like that. I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think like you said, like everybody has trauma, but they call it PTS or PTSD. They give it a label when the trauma kind of gets to this level where it makes things very messy. And yeah, I think what can happen is like you talk about in the film, there's like a fragmentation of the mind and things don't get integrated. And then years later, like you just said, there could be a death in the family or a divorce or something. And then all of a sudden, like this big mess starts happening and physiological changes. And it's like unexplainable things. And that's where you start to get that new level of trauma and PTS. And I'm wondering, like, did you experience that mess?
It was so part of the story is that trauma can be very non-remarkable. My story of trauma is not a great story. It's in terms of excitement. You know, I was bullied a little bit in school, and that was kind of it. But I was like super different on the other side of it. I was like a totally different person, and I drank too much to cope with it because I felt like I was weird and nobody wanted to talk to me. So clearly who I am is not good. So I need to change myself. But because I didn't have any of the tools to know how to do that, I went to alcohol to shut down a part of my brain that made me so self-conscious about who I was. Still in that process, I learned a lot about myself. I wouldn't go back and do it any differently. But what really got me into this film was my ex-husband's experience with PTSD. He was in the military for 15 years. And he was a high level for a lot of those years. He was a tier 1 sniper. And on the other side of that, he had a lot of traumatic brain injury from blasts. It was less psychological, but more brain injury stuff, which is really, really hard.
Yeah.
Like healing the brain is hard. So I saw this, I'm going to say evolution. It might sound like a de-evolution, but the evolution of a man that when I looked into his eyes, I saw home. And through the years of him integrating into civilian life, he started to deteriorate. This is pretty classic of people getting out of the military. A couple years in, that'll be when the symptoms start to happen. So there's not as much distraction. There isn't as much like linear order. It's like now you kind of just get to do whatever you want to do. And that's when the darkness sets in. So he to himself was unbearable, and our relationship started to become really, really challenging. And so knowing that, okay, this is a thing now, PTSD is a thing, there's got to be a silver lining, because coming out of that whole experience, is this really all you get? All you get is just a ruined relationship and no sense of who you are now. Like that just can't be it. So then we discovered post-traumatic growth, which was interestingly discovered or named at the same time PTSD was, in the early or the late 70s. And but because there's no money or funding in helping people heal and helping people understand that, hey, the thing that happened to you can be a harbinger of wisdom and greater appreciation for life, we really focused on the negative. There's a lot of money behind that. But also it was a good time for it too, because coming off of Nam and Afghanistan, well, Afghanistan hasn't happened yet, but at a Nam, and there were a lot of people that really needed PTSD to be acknowledged as a thing. So it's not like it was a complete psyop or anything, but it just seems like at this point, it'd be irresponsible not to talk about the other options. What's also interesting that's really important to bring up here is that PTS and post-traumatic growth, they happen at the same time. When you are different on the other side of something that was a lot, you're still going to have your bad days. You can still feel like you feel a lot. But the point is, with the growth, you can also feel that real elevation, because you can maybe tap into the time where you didn't have what you have now. So it's really poking some holes at the negativity bias that we have around the adversity in our lives.
I like that. Yeah, I like thinking of it as a deepening, because anytime you call something a disorder, it has this like negative connotation that it's like something bad. And then post-traumatic growth, it's like a little bit more neutral, but I would even say it has more of like a positive. You're saying like this is good, like, but post-traumatic deepening is maybe the middle ground there, like where it kind of encapsulates both the good and the bad there. Yeah.
Post-traumatic stress, I would say, if it becomes habitual, if you're habitually in those lower states, that's when it's a problem. But it's only a problem when it's a problem. Getting into that lower state, that's not good or bad. It just is part of the experience. And so with growth, when you're in those levels of unpleasantness, you're like, the point is to understand that this is part of the function.
I like that. Thank you.
So I'd like to just, since we're in the last bit of our conversation here, just to close out with an uplifting slant, give people a nice push out the door. So I want to loop back to something that Jessica was saying earlier, which was that one of the most valuable things that we can do for people is to refine our consciousness, is to open our heart, is to release some of these things, these shadows that have been holding us back, or lean into some of the shadow aspects which have new gifts for us. But just essentially, the more that we can grow as a person, the more that we then benefit everyone in our immediate surroundings and the legacy of humanity as it follows us. And perhaps even in an even more esoteric way, something that Jung postulated was this collective consciousness sort of thing. And some people think there's a tipping point for that. So if enough people are able to refine their consciousness, it just sort of helps everyone else as well. It just sort of tips the collective unconscious, the collective subconscious, into something which has greater awareness, which is not able to knowingly engage in harm and foul quite so easily. So that's an encouraging notion, but just in much more practical terms, it's, I know the difference when I take care of myself, when I do my practice in the morning. And there's so many people who have this idea that they can't commit 15 minutes to their own betterment because they have kids or they have responsibilities or they have a job. They're like, I don't have time for that. Well, it helps everything because it changes you, and you are everything. Everything you do is affected by the way that you are. So give yourself that gift, because you are in turn nourishing your environment. You are in turn leaving a lasting legacy. Like, I'm kinder to my family. I'm kinder to the people in my life. I'm a better human to interact with when I take care of myself and I give myself the gift of consciousness. So give yourself that gift, please.
Well said.
Jessica, anything you'd like to add here as we close on it?
I really appreciate that closeout. That was really lovely.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. I just want to loop back to the film. Is it still called Dark Night of Our Soul, or is it Post-Traumatic Growth?
Yes, it's Dark Night of Our Soul. And if you guys want to check it out, you can go to posttraumaticgrowth.film.
Gotcha.
And we were running a Kickstarter where you could watch the short film, but if you'd like to watch it, I can just email it to you. So you can email me at jessica@posttraumaticgrowth.film.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
Descriptions.
Yeah, we'll have all the links for everything. And thank you so much for joining us. Be well. We'll see you soon.
Goodbye, everybody.
Weird and Worthwhile Podcast.